Hey guys, what's going on? This is Brad from the Ad Army, and today I want to talk to you about the importance of basically getting new cards. So, this is one that I'll keep it short. This is also going to be a part of the budgeting series itself. But there's a reason that you need to learn about picking up new cards and also preparing. So before I get into it, as always, like, comment, and subscribe down below. It helps out and it's free. You can fill up the ranks of this army with yourself. So if that's the most important thing. But also, this is to help you guys out because I'll give you guys information that hopefully gets you along. And without further ado, thank you guys for listening. So let's get into it. So first and foremost, I want to talk about picking up new cards because this is something that is somewhat debated in Yugioh, kind of, because I know there's people that are more on the fence of like, I don't want to pick up a new deck until I have to, but I personally think that's not necessarily a good idea. Then there's people that say, oh, always pick up, stuff when you have a chance. It's easier that way, and it can help you along. I think I want to narrow down more on this focus of like getting new deck cores and sometimes staples, and the reason why is that I've already kind of talked about this before, where depending on what type of Yu-Gi-Oh player you want to be, when you want to be more casual, want to be more competitive, like where you want to go. My first thing that I like to talk about is when should you pick up new cards to kind of like, buff up your deck or just like switch out to a new strategy. Usually I would say you have to determine that on one, your income at the time, because I don't want you guys to like buy cards when you can't afford them. Two, your amount of playability. And three, and one of the most important ones, what can you do with it? Because, some of these criteria is returned from my other videos because it's kind of the obvious things. But when it comes to getting new cards, the thing is this. You can pick up new cards that are like really cheap and you can use them as techs. One of the cards I remember that was cheap, it's kind of cheap now, but it wasn't cheap before, which was like Nightmare Corruptor Ibli. I remember when I told my friend who was actually playing sprites because everyone was getting ready for Power of the Elements to get this card, he was looking at me like, why should I get this card? I told him, one, it's cheap right now. Two, you can summon it because it's a level 2 monster, and then you can link it off into whatever you want, and then there you go. So, that was a way of teaching, kind of like, oh, it's a good way to get a card. And it's one of the pluses is like picking up a card really depends on like how much money you have, in my opinion, because you don't want to overbuy, right? But the point is, if you buy the card and you're going to use it readily, a lot, I think it's a great pickup, right? I think that's a fantastic buy. I don't think you should feel upset about paying the money for it, because if you're going to use it and you're going to play a lot, like I always say before, there's no reason that it's a bad thing, right? Like if you're going to play a ton, buying cards is actually fine because you're going to use it. That's the point. If you don't play as much, I would say think about it more, because if you play like maybe, I would say like twice a month, and you don't like necessarily play competitively, I kind of don't see the reason why you maybe want to pick up too many competitive cards, because they're going to be pretty expensive unless like you're trying to like save up. But yeah, that's kind of like where I want to go with that one, is that picking up cards is like essential if you're going to be playing a lot. And if you just want to like buff up on your decks because like maybe a support card comes out, as long as you can get it for a decent price, I don't think that's a bad thing. Also, picking up new cards in the aspect of like, affordability. Sometimes it's better to spend that $20 on a deck core you can afford versus like maybe $20 on a singular card, just because it will eventually buff up your, your decks as a whole. So you can take advantage of that. I think that's where that part goes where it needs to be. Next, and far more, more importantly, like what can you do with it? So like this is something that's very important to, budget players, but more or less like normal players. Like a good example is like for a lot of competitive players, when you start to like listen to them, like actually listen to how they think about the game, you realize the skill gap between like lots of players, because it's just not just about like basic deck building. It's like very fundamental understanding of like the states that you're going to be in the game, like your board state. Do cards progress you? Do they, only progress you when you're in a win more position? Do you like help yourself out when you're in like a bad position? Like how do these cards help you? Like when you start to hear competitive players, it kind of really helps you in justifying your own spending habits, to be honest. At least that's how I see it. Like if you just want to play for fun and you don't mind ripping up product, and you're kind of like a collector, or more like you just vibe with like, oh, I want to rip open packs and like build fun decks, I actually like that too. I think that's like fantastic. I actually really love those people. Like you guys, you take out my own heart when I play against like random decks at like locals. I don't even care if sometimes it's like completely jank. It's just fun because you guys keep the spirit alive of what I think the game is supposed to, keep going. It's like you're just having a good time and playing whatever you want. So I really enjoy that. So for the casual crowd, you have my heart, you have my thanks. But yeah, for this like understanding of like why you need it and kind of like how you're going to use it, it's really important because it's like this. If you were going to pick up 3 copies of Cashier Fenrir from the Megatins right now, be honest with yourself. Are you going to plug that in the deck? Are you going to play Cash in its nerfed form without a Rise Heart? Or are you just picking it up because you want Fenrir? And the answer is like, yeah, that's pretty good, but this is where like you start to realize you can't just plug in great cards into a singular deck and hope that it makes it broken. This is where you have to start like actually deck building, theory crafting, really buffing up your mental state of like, how am I going to like play the game? And how am I going to make my game better by getting these cards? So, that's like one of those things for when you're budgeting, trying to make, save your money. Picking up certain cards aren't always the best thing, but it doesn't mean that like buying them without a purpose is better too. So you really need to think it out. Now, third and foremost, what like replacing your cards. So the reason I talk about this is like if you buy a budget deck that's like not necessarily tier 1, but like maybe like tier 1.5, tier 2, and it's like pretty decent, so it has like some wins. One thing I would say is if your deck starts to like get a lot of wins, think about maybe having a secondary deck, because there's a good chance that if we do get like a massive ban list at any point, or just a ban list in general, something that deck might use might get hit, something that like it has as like just maybe an extension piece or an extra deck monster might get limited banned, something like that. The point is you don't want your deck to rely on stuff that you can't either use, or it's not going to remain the same way. Like that's the reason why I technically would tell people that it's best to stock up on certain cards, like just keep them. I know some people don't like keeping cards, like they literally just like to move them and then pick them up when they need them. But personally, I don't like to do that for everything. Like I think some cards are necessities, whereas like some of them are like more teched out specials where like, yeah, you could just get rid of it unless like you have the room for it. This falls in like with special tech cards like continuous traps, sometimes like floodgates. You can like pick up these cards, but do you really want to like have to utilize them in that capacity? Like, do you want to have a bunch of them? That's one of the issues I see that with a lot of players is that you don't want to necessarily force yourself into like having way too many cards that you don't use, but at the same time, you don't want to have too few cards that when you need to play in a format or play another deck that you can't keep up with the meta because you just don't have anything. I think I'll make a budget video at some point about like how I stock up on cards in terms of like what I think is a good way to like have like a pseudo collection for just staples. But yeah, that kind of like crosses off that, because if you guys aren't prepared and like pulling in new cards, you're never going to be fully adapt to the meta. I don't think there's any one deck that like continuously doesn't have to change. Like, yeah, you can say a stun deck doesn't have to change, but like, let's keep it real. You do have to like add new pieces to a stun deck to make it better. You do have to like replace control pieces because like, yeah, something might come to the meta that like really hurts it. Like a good example is like Eldritch. I had a friend that plays Eldritch, and I had like these 3 guys at locals when I would go regularly that just played Eldritch, right? But what happened was as people started getting bestials like more frequently and people switched over to like something like branded, yeah, the problem was they just wanted to play Eldritch because they didn't want to play anything else. But Eldritch started to get like losses just immediately. Like they'd have skill drain up, they'd still lose, and the reason why was their deck didn't evolve. Like their strategy was simply just go for it and hold it fun. And these guys had some fun, but then sometimes they'd be annoying and be like, oh, I lost like super poly, or the guy, hit me with a Magnamut or something. But the point is like, don't get frustrated necessarily if you're losing a lot in the aspect that like you don't improve your decks, because you can play as well as possible. Like you can become the great player with the cards you have available, but there's always going to be a limit to what that means. It's like it's hitting the wall, right? Like you can only go so far with what you've got. At some point, you're going to have to either add to it or find a way to like really buff it up. And like I said, there's nothing wrong with it, guys. I think it's fantastic if you don't want to like have to buy into like expensive staples. I'm not saying like buy Thrust or anything like that. Or, like say you want to have like a removal, but you don't want to pay money for like Kurikara right now. Completely fine. I think that's fantastic. Like find budget alternatives, make it work for you. But at the end of the day, you can't pretend and say like, okay, I can only make it work with like my $30 core deck that haven't changed in like 2 or 3 years, right? Like that's just not gonna work. You got to keep evolving. It's like just like with anybody in life, right? You just got to keep grinding and getting better. But yeah, I think this is where I'm going to get to like concluding this video, because pretty much it's just focusing on like why it's important to get new cards. There's nothing wrong with it. I think, Yu-Gi-Oh as a whole, one of its problems with like not having a rotation format is that like we get a lot of cards brought into the game, like new cards, but they don't do anything, if you know what I mean. Like they don't really do much. Like I think a lot of the pack filler stuff for like the core sets, like yeah, some of these cards like may see niche play, or some of their archetypes see like a decent rogue play sometimes, or like niche play or combos, extensions in decks. But my point that I want to get across to you guys is that with new cards, you can really buff up your deck. So there's nothing wrong with improving it. And yeah, at the end of the day, if you're budgeting effectively, taking care of your business, and able to handle everything else in your life, cards are the secondary thing, but you can afford them. So pretty much just wanted to tackle that today, guys. Nothing too crazy, just more of a conversation on picking up new cards and why you should always be improving your decks. So, as always, this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.